Hello. Since I'm on the road, I still wanted to stop and run through a couple things in Romans that I was reading from the Apostle Paul. Of course, chapter 1 mainly is discerning the fact that Paul's an apostle set apart, that he does long to visit Rome, and he's made a multitude of attempts to visit it, but it had been shut down or had been circumstances surrounding it that prevented his arrival in Rome. And so he's making that known to the Romans that, his arrival has come, and it wasn't without, strenuous trying prior to now that he made his attempts to get there. And so that's basically what you're seeing in the first half of chapter 1, and that doesn't seem to need too much explanation. It's pretty clear. However, I wanted to point out something that comes about seemingly in about chapter 19. Verse 19, and verse 20. And I like how he says, and I think these words carry weight. I think they carry weight still today, especially since there is no real scholarly debate that can exist or does exist in in theological circles on even the legitimacy of Paul's testimonies. I mean, that's pretty well agreed upon. I think there's some discrepancies among scholars when it comes down to the order of his epistles that were issued, who translated them, the historians that surrounded that time, what the dates are, but it's almost fairly certain in theological circles that Paul existed and Paul testified to his experience to the people that he claims he did. The semantics surrounding that, as far as that are under debate, seem to be trivial to me. And that's just some background on my opinion on that. I think that's kind of a common precept understood. I also find it interesting that 2005, the Catholic Church did say and did acknowledge that they had discovered his tomb, and it was found adorned with frankincense, myrrh, incense, things like that, and it had been carved into it, his name, things like that, and it was outside the walls of Rome, I do believe, and it seems to be very similar to the location written down by historians of that time. And so what I like about Paul is the visceralness of his existence does help someone like me whenever trying to come to grips with the reality of religious tradition and narratives, because I've always struggled with translational issues being a problem and have come to grips with that not really being an issue, and that can be explained further in future videos. However, if you are stuck in like a rut that surrounds the translation and the word-for-word correlates, and then you're thinking that maybe that affects the overall chapter or the overall letter to the Romans, as far as what meaning you can derive from it, then that is of a concern. And I do implore you to go and read a book called Misquoting Jesus, or Dethroning Jesus. I'm sorry, Misquoting Jesus is actually by Bart Ehrman, and Dethroning Jesus is a book on basically a response to that, basically explaining the triviality of the translational mistakes from the Greek to English, and making sure that people don't just dismiss the entire letter to the Romans or any of Paul's Gospels or Paul's letters simply on the notion that there could have been translational differences in words. And so I recommend you read those books if you do have doubts on those. There's two sides presented, so you read both of them if you'd like and come to your own conclusion. But I do like the visceralness that surrounds Paul as a saint and his testimonies, because it's scientifically and historically verifiable. So that's a good thing, and that helps somebody who's rationally minded, who's approaching Christianity, come at it at a direction where they can at least tie their minds to that and know that this man existed, and know that his tomb was found, and know that there's a lot of documentation surrounding his proselytization and his attempts to spread the gospel to the Gentiles. So that helps kind of break the ice on the rational-minded approach to Christianity that would generally shut somebody down right at the door. At least cling to history as your left brain desires, something like that, something written down, something from somebody else, and things like that. That generally was what I would require, and I dismissed its existence in totality. So I would like to point that out, and I think that there's something to Paul's letters that carry a lot of weight even still today. He says that a numerous amount of times, that this applies today, tomorrow, and to the end. So it's worth noting. And so that being said, as I read through here, Paul basically explaining God's wrath against those that are wicked, okay? And that's a generalized term, wickedness and things of that nature, but that's pretty well defined in the Bible. And so I'm mainly going to focus on one sentence that exists in verse 20. He says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse." And so that there is obviously clearly seen. Well, if you're looking and seeing with eyes and sensory apparatuses and things of that nature, and you're already hardened against any kind of Christian actual miracles or works of God or anything of that nature in the world, then you're probably not going to see it in today's world, and myself included. I mean, I'm not like I'm seeing miracles or anybody's really seeing miracles, but it's also hard to see miracles when you're completely closed down to them too. So I think maybe there's something to maybe being open to that, open to the divine nature actually maybe accomplishing some things, because science generally likes to put a box around materialism as a philosophy and assume that, through a microscope can be seen everything, and then we can basically tell everyone the nature of the cave, as Plato would say. We could basically discern it, but we could never say why or how or when or where or what started it. And so science still reaches an impasse at that point for me as far as why and when, and it's not merely gap filling to say that we would place the Gospel of Romans in the gap of science, because that was always something that I deferred to. Whenever somebody would use religion, I would say, well, you're just not waiting long enough. You're not waiting long enough for science to come to your aid. But the thing is science isn't supposed to come to anybody's aid when it comes to existential quandaries. It's really not. That's really not its job. I don't think scientists that are of their merit usually say that they make those claims. I don't think that they generally say that religion's a gap filler. That's more of a newer atheist authors and things of that nature, journalists, that pick and choose different topics and then kind of like hammer them down like pretty heavily, and they're not really looking at the idea that science I don't think existed for the sake of determining the why, when, and where, and how, but yet we have an internal, intrinsic, innate longing to know the answer to those questions, and everybody does. And so we play, a game essentially to avoid having to go back to this archaic text. At least I did, and I still do sometimes, and I'm trying to read it and understand that that's not the way to view this book, and that's not the way to view religious custom either, really, in general. And I find it interesting too that a lot of times when you say this, people point back to Aristotle, and Plato and Socrates. But what's interesting there is those gentlemen, when they were philosophizing, were not necessarily placing more merit upon actual physics and actual science that they were supposedly coming up with on the same level as metaphysics. I mean, Aristotle's metaphysics was still rising to the top of the pyramid as far as they were concerned, as what was the answer to these kind of quandaries that exist, these existential questions. They still put more merit on Aristotle's and Plato's metaphysical topics above the actual observations of the cave, so to speak. So there's something to be said there that, the idea of science and religion coexisting is very easy to do, because if they just acknowledge both their roles and why they started to begin with, and that there would be no reason to have science if there was no reason to want to answer those questions. But what's the reason to want to answer those? And so that we always end up there. We always end up at an impasse of sorts. Sort of like Aquinas said, whenever there's something being moved, there's somebody that moved it. And there's this infinitely long line of movers moving things, but there has to be an original mover of things, which is kind of Newtonian in its sense, because every action has an equal but opposite reaction, but what calls the first action? And so I know that there's a lot more depth to Aquinas' argument there, which requires reading of his proofs and his 5 reasons why religion is real, or why God is existing. But that is something that helps break down these walls, these intellectual walls that barricade us from seeing the narrative fabric that weaves behind our world. And so I think it's very important to see any kind of actual act of God. We're really quick to use the phrase act of God when blaming things bad. We're quick to say, well, we can't control tornadoes. We call them acts of God, in legal documents. But when something good happens, it's non-existent. We don't say act of God when somebody gets, miraculously saved from a burning car, but we're really quick to say act of God when 100 people die in a hurricane. And I would like to acknowledge that both of those are most certainly an act of God. And that's not to be non-empathetic towards the people that perish. And also, I want to support the people that live. I want to support their narrative as well and proclaim God through that. I think that He exists in the thread behind both of those, essentially. But that being said, is simply just to provide a platform to get to the last part of this verse, which says, "His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse." Okay, and so taking this out of context from the prior verse there, without excuse kind of is a common thread in Paul. I mean, he doesn't allow much excuse for when somebody is seeking, from when somebody is outside the mold, for when somebody believes in what they're seeking, what they're doing. He doesn't allow for a lot of excuse, and he states that. And I think the original Greek text is even a more powerful tone behind the word that translates to excuse. And depending on the translation to English that you read, you will see even more heavy-duty terms surrounding the word excuse as more implorable, that this is not okay to make excuses whenever other people are doing and seeking and going and trying to find out answers to the quandaries that are presented, because those questions and seeking the answers to them is what leads to insight, and insight leads to religion. I think insight is a key component to arriving at a religious affiliation of any type or a religious truth in an intellectually minded person. But insight has to be cultivated, and insight and cultivation of insight has to be done with an open mind. And so that's another topic for another time. But insight is often very overlooked. But without excuse, the reason I bring this up is because I see throughout all the religious customs I was brought into as a child, as I was voluntarily entered into as an adult, that I cycled through out of religiously affiliated schools, I noticed that all they generally seem to do is excuse. It's an excuse to not do what these gospels say. In fact, I don't mean to be any harsh, because I don't know much about these gospels yet. I'm going through them probably pretty elementary level right now, but I have a conviction that these are true, and so I do have an obligation, I feel, to try to clarify to other people that may have been atheists or still are, to help maybe break the barriers down. And so the excuse thing is a huge deal to me, because I was raised in so many different religions, and not really religions, but just Protestant branches of the same religion, which also Paul speaks heavily to in the Corinthians, saying that we don't need all these splintering off of religions, which is another topic as well. We really don't, and having that is not something that's of the gospel, in my opinion. I welcome any conflicting theological interpretations as well to come from that, because I don't know enough to say that for a fact. I'm just reading Paul verbatim, and it seems like he would shout down that splintering of different sects in between all the different churches that exist. And so maybe that's something to be addressed later. But I highlight the fact that Paul is vicious in his delivery, and he's vicious in his discipleship, and he's vicious in the ability for people to allow the seeker to seek. And I find that throughout all these different customs, they don't put merit to Paul's words as if they mean something. They take them and then they rearrange them in their head to formulate some way to jump around some of the concepts he seems to want to willingly present. And that is an excuse in itself. And so I find it kind of disheartening too, that if you're expecting a generation of new atheists to be Christians or convert, but yet you're raising them in a way that's not of the gospel, that's not of the words of the gospel, and is just repeating John 3:16 from the NIV, and then singing songs at Sunday school, which are great things. But if that's all you're doing, which is all I felt like was done to me, I left church sermons, departed with them half the time, probably by my own unlistening or not paying attention like I should have, because I didn't want to be there, as I'm sure many people can identify with. However, I can listen, and I do remember trying to seek religion as a younger person and being turned away due to the fact that the biblical words and the gospel and the letters Paul wrote were like, they were almost like people acted, maybe they're open to interpretation. And that is the enemy of absolutes. And without absolutes, we run into subjectivity, which subjectivity begets New Ageism and other ways to go formulate morality. And so we really have to almost look within the church's Protestantism, Catholicism, all the splintering of it has been a direct result, or basically a direct parent to all of the issues that are occurring within the church that seem to chase people away, because we've ran off absolute interpretation. We look at the Bible as if it can mean anything. It can mean almost anything to anyone, and it never remains consistent, from Episcopalian to Methodist, to Baptist, to Southern Baptist, to Northern Baptist, to Anglican, Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Orthodox Catholic, Gnostic. All of these things exist because people want to believe different things about the words of the Bible that fit them, it seems to me. I'm sure some of them are closer than others. I'm sure some of them are, some of them aren't. But to me, it's almost like that provides the excuse that Paul reiterates later in Corinthians. He's saying without excuse, but yet the excuse is that we just splintered off all these different ways, and that's how we arrived here. So then we can say that was that's not our fault, right? We're not making that excuse. That excuse was made for us by the existence of all these different branches. How are we supposed to know what to choose, right? Well, it seems like going back to the text of the Bible and looking at the letters of Paul with reverence and understanding that the word carry meaning, and that meaning is derived simply from the fact that a word exists. So to rearrange these words and say, well, he doesn't mean excuse, he means something or another in a different thing. No, he really doesn't. Paul's not a scholar of men. He's not a philosopher. He's not somebody who's going. He was a Pharisee. He was putting Christians to death. Paul wasn't necessarily the most learned man. And he's not speaking in tongues, and he's not speaking in metaphorical analyses, and he's not trying to either. He's to the point, and he makes that known. Even in the Greek correlates, you can tell that that's what he means. And so I don't understand how we can say without excuse in Romans when he's talking about, turn away from wickedness, and also in that regard, it's saying that when people are trying to go and find this religion, they have to do so per the gospel, which says to steadfastly pursue. Without excuse, can you prevent that? But yet, all I feel like I was exposed to throughout Protestantism and upbringing in those churches was continual excuses for why we didn't have to adhere to certain parts of the Bible, which basically degraded the letters from Paul. I never went to a church, and if I did and I didn't pay attention, that's of another story. But I did try, I believe, and I did go back in high school age and did try to analyze this. I took Old and New Testament classes and realized that there's something to these Gospels, but nobody adheres to them. But that's just my interpretation, maybe. As a former atheist, that was my reasoning for not liking the Bible, was misinterpretations. Nobody took it literally. And and I understand there's metaphorical and allegorical meanings to these texts, obviously. But there's not this diverse array of excuses to make to interpret them in 1,000 different manners. That's the opposite of what he speaks to in Corinthians with the splintering of the church. So blaming the splintering of the church into different schools on the fact that you don't have a uniform interpretation is self-defeating, being that Paul said both of these things. He said, don't make excuses and don't splinter the church. So if you did one of the two, you need to go back to the Bible, it seems to me, and really read the letters of Paul. And so in my attempt to make this channel and to expose some of these things that I found that have brought me to Christianity, I've actually been met by Christians in the world, or self-proclaimed Christians, and once again, self-proclaimed myself as well. I mean, I'm still trying to learn. I'm open to rapid belief change, but in this case, I feel convicted in Jesus that this is a divinely inspired book. So I feel of my obligation to explain why it took me so long to get here, and give you guys updates as I learn more, and hopefully you guys can do the same, back and forth, like a dialogue almost of sorts, so that I'm making sure I'm sticking to a correct interpretation without disrespecting, and also just bringing to the table some of the things that might break some others out of the shell that I was in, because it's a shell that's justified. It's a shell that's justified, and it is, because of the way that I was taught, I believe. I think that my conviction to find this later on in life was due to my own soul searching for it and having to go through a lot of different religions, because I had already had a distaste developed towards Christianity because of the miserable interpretations that I had been exposed to. And that, to me, is a major problem. Misinterpretation begets doubt, which doubt begets skepticism, and then there's a large presence of skepticism because science does answer a lot of questions, and we need to break the walls down between that battle, too, science-religion battle, which the Catholic Church seems to do pretty well. You've got very good bishops in the Catholic Church I've seen that aren't afraid to delve into Aquinas and philosophical reasonings for the existence of a creator. And so I find that very reverent of them to try to do. So that's helping too, but we're coupling history, philosophy here. Let's leave science to do its own thing and let philosophy, religion, and those kinds of things, those kinds of proofs establish this motif. And so I still find it very interesting that Paul says no excuses. Well, the excuse is the splintering of the church. Well, he says don't do that either. So then you're at a catch-22 where you're in a circular reasoning, logical fallacy type predictive model. And instead of that, let's break the walls down of that and just go straight to the Word. Don't make excuses. If somebody's seeking after the Lord and they're going to go ahead and make a change and make an attempt to go and find that truth, all I've run into is discouragement, aside from very few people. And so I find that interesting. I find it interesting that even through childhood, with the misinterpretations and the doubt, they never seem to be able to provide an answer to that absolute quandary that existed in everybody's mind. And now when I go and try to find it myself, I am seemingly met with a lot of opposition and a lot of excuses. And so maybe the simple method of converting people shouldn't be with the word converting, because converting seems to carry weight that's not necessary, and also carries a connotation that almost discourages people from even wanting to be converted. So I think you should go back to and not make excuses, and also not rely on the splitting of the church as your justification for your whimsical interpretation of its writings, especially when it comes to St. Paul, because he's proselytizing to the Gentiles, and that's what his job is, and he's doing it steadfastly. And so if anybody does that today, it seems almost like they're met with a lot of opposition and excuses and splintering of branches, and that leads to the atheism that Christians claim to despise. So I think that it's almost an internal revolution of Christianity that must occur so that everybody doesn't have to go through this journey I went through to get to the truth. If you don't expedite the process to truth within Christianity, and you force people to all take this journey of 8 months or 10 months or a year long of going through all these different things, you're going to lose a lot of potential converts if that's what your goal is to convert. And so I think Paul is black and white in his delivery of words. He is a former prosecutor of Christians. He has no meaning and no reason to do anything but continue to do what he's doing before, except because of his road to Damascus and his experience. And history proves his existence, and his words are clear. And I think that excuses lead to the problem of less Christians today. And then the church blames society, but church is supposedly the fabric of society at the same time. So if you're the fabric of society, wouldn't that be you should appeal to seekers? Everybody's seeking. So provide a red carpet, roll it out to people, and stop excluding people would seem to me to be the way to maybe have a dialogue with intelligent people instead of shutting out intellect and saying it's all bad. Maybe not. But I think there's wise words to be heard in the language of St. Paul. And I think that there's something critical to going back to the Greek as well for you to get the absolute correlate, because sometimes one English word doesn't seem to capture the word excuse to me in the way the Greek would imply. And so my point is I hope that maybe as you go through Romans or go through Corinthians or go through Paul's letters, that you look at them as if you were Paul or something. I mean, as if you were Paul, somebody who was seeking hardly and found something and then wanted to tell people about it in the black and white language. That's what he did, and it's interpreted as if he wrote it like an Aristotelian proof, where there's all these different angles to approach it, and there really doesn't seem to be. And that seems to be a fragmentary part of it. A fragmentary part of the church that's already fragmented, which he most certainly proselytized against, the fracturing of it. So maybe it's an internal investigation of the church itself rather than outward blame upon the atheist for not believing. Maybe it could be upon the source. That's the reason why the moral fabric of the society isn't based within their framework any longer. But I do agree that it's critical that it stays within the framework of these churches, because that moral framework does philosophically justify a lot of great things, and it does have a direct correlate to success of societies as far as life, love, and absolute virtuosity that needs to be present in order to develop communities and people to have children that they can be conscious of when they pass away are still going to be around with values. And I think that's an important thing for people with children too. So if you have a second, I think maybe talk to Paul or read through Paul's Roman letters like he was writing to you, and don't try to make any mental gymnastics around the idea of what he's saying, and maybe this truth will become more clear, or maybe it won't, and maybe I'm wrong. Either way, it's something worth thinking about, and it's something worth considering. And so, that being said, I appreciate y'all's time. Have a great evening.